Okay, you've made it this far, and we have only a few short chapters until we are finished our current book, The Sword of Mercy. So we're going to start with chapter 81, which is called Out to Sea. Nereza yanked on the tiller, turning the launch to starboard as it pulled alongside the Nimbus. Crewmen on the Nimbus dropped 2 steel cables down from the boat hoist. Nereza's men began securing them to the bow and the stern of the launch so it could be lifted aboard the steamship. Nereza glanced back toward the island. No sign of pursuit. Apparently the chief had taken him at his word. Fool. The cables were secure and Nereza looked up, preparing to shout the order to start the hoist. He saw 2 crewmen waving frantically at him, shouting and pointing. He turned to look, and his mouth fell open. Rounding the stern of the Nimbus was a craft unlike Nereza had any seen, looking more like a collapsed building than a ship. It had a bright pink sail spouting from it. It would have been funny except for the look on the men on the ship, a look Nereza had seen before, although not for many years. Pirates. "Start the hoist," he bellowed, and a second later the cables tensed and the launch came wobbling out of the water. It rose slowly, and with each second the pirates drew closer. Nereza saw their leader now, a tall man with dark, deep-set eyes and a huge black mustache. And a hook. Now Nereza knew exactly whom he was up against. "Faster!" he yelled to the men on the deck. But the hoist had only 1 speed, and it was not quite fast enough. As the launch dangled on the side of the Nimbus, 15 feet above the water, the pirate ship plowed into it. The launch spun with a few sideways spinning out of control, and then with a sickening lurch, it slammed into the steamer's steel hull. And then the cable snapped. The stern of the launch dropped like a rock, dumping everyone and everything into the sea. Everything, that is, except for the Starstuff chest. For a few seconds, it hung in midair. Then it began to descend lazily, drifting in the breeze, until it settled gently on the foredeck of the pirate ship. With a roar of triumph, Hook spun the wheel. Now we're back with Shining Pearl. Shining Pearl was a good swimmer, but she had the bad luck of being at the stern of the launch, which meant that the other occupants landed on top of her. In an instant after she plunged into the water, a booted foot slammed into her head, stunning her, and a second later, another impact drove her deeper. Losing consciousness, she swallowed water and felt herself drifting down into the dark water below. And then strong arms wrapped around her, and she was being lifted toward the light. She burst through the surface and turned to see her rescuer. It was Teacher, leader of the mermaids, and an old friend of the mollusks, who had been summoned by Tinkerbell. A moment later, Teacher's powerful tail was propelling Shining Pearl swiftly towards the shore and her anxious father. There were 3 other mermaids in the water, and they were not being so kind to the rest of the swimmers. They swarmed around the flailing men, nipping at their arms with their needle-sharp teeth. The terrified swimmers screamed for their crewmates on deck to throw down the lines. They grabbed them and climbed up with desperate speed. And when things finally got sorted out on deck, the crew realized that 2 men were missing, O'Neill and Nereza. It was assumed they had fallen victim to the savage mermaid creatures. Nobody wanted to go looking for them, not in these unwelcome waters, and the remaining officers quickly made their decision. The Nimbus turned and at full steam headed out to sea. Far astern, a pile of floating debris, some sea planks and canvas that had fallen out of the launch when the cable broke, were moving slowly and steadily toward the island. And that's the end of that chapter. Chapter 82 is called So Close. Peter was clinging to the rigging in the Jolly Roger and was trying to decide what to do. Below him, Hook, who for the moment had apparently forgotten about his unwelcome passenger, was loudly celebrating his courageous defeat of the enemy ship, now streaming rapidly away in his brilliant capture of the treasure. Hook stood on the foredeck, 1 foot on the chest, declaring to his crew that its contents would make them the most feared pirates on the sea, even land, because now the ship could fly. Hook had seen it before with his own eyes. The pirates cheered and Hook beamed. Looking down, Peter worried. Because Hook was right. With that much star stuff, he could do unimaginable damage if he didn't kill himself and the crew first. Peter looked around for allies. The mermaids had departed, apparently satisfied that the steamship had left and their job was done. There were mollusks on the beach, but they were hundreds of yards away. Even Tinkerbell at the moment seemed to be missing. That left Peter, who wasn't even sure he was strong enough to fly down onto the deck, let alone take on a boatload of pirates. But who else was there? "Hook!" he shouted. The pirate captain looked up. The triumph on his face turned to fury. "You! Get off my ship! The chest is dangerous. You'll all die if you open it. You can't keep it." "Oh, is that so? And who's going to take it away from me?" Peter stood up in the rigging. His knees felt weak. He hoped he had enough strength. "I'm going to stop you," he said. Hook smiled, revealing the rows of irregular brown stumps that passed for his teeth. He drew his sword. "All right, boy. Come down and stop me." Peter took a breath. His plan was to swoop down so close to Hook and draw him away from the chest. Then Peter would pull up, swerve around him, grab the chest, and carry it overboard. It was a good plan. The question was, did Peter have enough strength? He let out a breath and dove for the ringing. The first part of the plan worked. Peter swooped down, Hook came toward him away from the chest, but Peter tried to stop his descent, swerved around Hook, and he found he was far weaker than he feared. He slammed into the deck, barely breaking his fall with his arms, and rolled to a stop. The pirates started forward, and Hook bellowed at them to stay back. "This moment is mine." Peter, on his back, his body screaming in pain, opened his eyes to see Hook standing over him. "This time I'll make sure you're dead." Slowly, enjoying the moment, he began to raise his sword. Peter tried to roll sideways to escape, but Hook's boot came down on him, shoving him back. The boot pressed against Peter's pocket, and Peter felt something sharp. I'm going to give you a second to think about what might be in Peter's pocket. It was the tip, the sword of mercy. He had forgotten to drop it with the sword. Frantically, Peter reached for his pocket. "Now, boy, you die," said Hook, and he brought the sword down. He was aiming for Peter's neck. His aim was true, but Peter's hand was just quick enough as he brought the sword tip to meet Hook's downward thrust. There was a clash and a clattering sound as the tip of Hook's sword tumbled across the deck and into the sea. Hook held up his broken sword, staring in disbelief. From the deck, Peter saw a brilliant light over the pirate's shoulder. It was Tinker Bell. To Peter, she looked like an angel. "Stay down," she chimed, and for a moment Peter wondered why, and then he saw the sleek, silvery shape hurtling through the air. It was The porpoise launched himself from the water onto the starboard side, slamming into Hook's body, sending him sprawling onto the deck. Am's momentum carried the porpoise over the port side. Before he re-entered the water, 2 more airborne porpoises appeared on the starboard side, both aiming for the star-stuffed chest, their blunt noses hitting at it precisely the same moment. "No!" screamed Hook as he watched the star-stuffed chest slide off the ship and into the sea. Realizing what was next, he shouted, "Get the boy!" But it was too late. With a roar of fury, Hook watched Peter, who had crawled to the edge of the deck, slip over the side, landing gently on the star-stuffed chest, which bobbed in the water like a cork. Gathered round it were a dozen smiling porpoises and a very satisfied Tinker Bell. "Lower the boats!" shouted Hook. "Get the harpoons! I want that boy and I want that chest!" His crew, who knew that the Jolly Roger had no boats to lower and no harpoons, just stood there. "Captain," said Smee, tugging at Hook's sleeve. "What is it?" said Hook, whirling in fury. I think we better get going." "And why?" Smee pointed and Hook looked. Coming around the point of the island were 24 or more big canoes, each full of mollusk warriors. Hook looked down at the ocean, where the chest that would have made him the most feared pirate on the sea or land, bobbed gently in the wake. So close. Then he looked at the canoes. "Make for Pirates' Cove," he said, slumping his shoulders. The battered ship made it that far and no farther. When it reached the cove, its overburdened pumps finally gave out, and it settled into the bottom of the cove in the exact spot where it had sat for more than 20 years, as if it never left. So before we finish up, I just want to take you back to the opening of the book, way back when we read this chapter about Ogier, okay, and Charlemagne. And so what the authors did, which what they love to do, is they start the book, they have the story go, and then they come back to the same spot, kind of going full circle. So the scene with Peter being saved by the Sword of Mercy with Hook matches up perfectly with the opening scene that we had with Charlemagne. All right, so 2 more things to take care of. chapter 83. The sun went down on a boisterous celebration in the mollusk village. There was much to celebrate. With the safe return of the children and the recovery of the chest, there was also much to talk about. Peter was considerable prodding from Tinkerbell, told of his harrowing adventures in the strange place called London. Shining Pearl, Little Scallop, and the Lost Boys told their stories. There was laughter, a lot of hugging, and some crying, including a tearful promise by Shining Pearl to her father that she would never, ever, ever again disobey the rule about leaving the village at night. She also promised she would give him something for his birthday, although it definitely was not going to be a white starfish. Shining Pearl had decided those weren't such good luck after all. Fighting Prawn, though happy about the return of the children, still had some concerns. One was dealing with the star stuffed chest, which now sat in the center of the village, guarded by warriors. Fighting Prawn had decided that the star stuff had to be returned to the underground pool. When Peter was strong again, the mollusk would take the chest back to the cave, and there Peter could open it and pour it in there. The mollusk would block the cave with rocks so it could never be violated again. But that was for another day. Fighting Prawn had greater concerns at the moment, as of the fate of Bold Abalone and Fleet Snail. He had faith in them. They were both resourceful warriors, especially his son. He had every reason to hope that they had been able to avoid the crushing jaws of Mr. Grin. But he would not sleep until they've returned. Chapter 84 is called The Last Sound. Nereza and Cheeky O'Neill had decided to wait until dark before landing on the island. Hitting in the jumble of wood, they managed to avoid the mermaids. And then they paddled toward the island. They hugged the coast. They paddled talking in low voices. They were both competent and ruthless men. They were going to get that trunk. And they would have no doubt they would defeat the primitive mollusks, especially since the mollusks thought they were dead. The first task was to find a place to hide. As night fell, they paddled towards the shore, landing on a small, curved beach. It felt good to have their legs on land again. They grabbed the planks and the canvas and started dragging them up the beach, planning to hide them in the dark jungle looming ahead. They heard a crashing sound. "What was that?" said Nereza. "I don't know," said O'Neill. Another sound. They looked into the jungle. They could only see blackness. Then a figure burst from the jungle, sprinting towards them. It was a man. Right behind him was a second man. The two men were running straight for them, and as they came close, Nereza and O'Neill saw they were mollusk warriors. Nereza and O'Neill raised their hands, ready to fight off an attack. But the men ran right past them, one on each side. O'Neill and Nereza turned and watched, stunned, as the men ran straight into the water and began swimming out to sea as fast as they could. "What?" began Nereza, but he was halted by an awful roar from the jungle behind them. And that was the last sound either man ever heard. So the authors want you to connect the dots there as to who took care of Nereza and O'Neill and what happened to them. And I'm sure you're able to figure out what exactly happened. So those were the two things we needed to wrap up, Nereza and O'Neill, and then, of course, Mr. Grin. So now that we've done that, we have hit something that's called the epilogue. It's the last page of the book. It just kind of ties together any loose ends, and then you're officially finished. The epilogue is one of my favorite parts of the book. It goes back to London, and I want you to really pay attention to how the story ends. "Tonight's story," said Wendy, "is why the moon changes its shape." "You told us that one already," said John. "'Cause the elephant eats it," says Michael. "Which is stupid," said John. "Well, if that's going to be your attitude," said Wendy, "perhaps there won't be a story tonight." "Why are you so moody?" said John. "I am not moody," said Wendy. "You are too," said John. "I am not." "Mom said she was moodly too," said Michael. "It's not moodly, you ninny. It's moody." "That's what I said." "When did Mom said she was moody?" "When Peter left," said Michael. "That's not why I'm moody," said Wendy. "So you are moody." "Mom says he's coming back. She says he always does." "Yes," said Wendy, "but not for years." "How long is years?" said Michael. "A long time," said Wendy. She was quiet for a few seconds, then said, "Well, do you want the story or don't you? Does it have to be the elephant one? Can it be a giraffe instead?" said Michael. "I suppose," said Wendy. "All right then," said Michael. "All right," said John, a bit more reluctantly. "Once upon a time," said Wendy, "there was a very hungry giraffe who—" "Wait," said Michael. "What now?" said Wendy. "Can't you hear it?" said Michael. Hear what? Said both John and Wendy. Listen. So they listened, and this time they heard it. Someone was tapping on the window. And you've officially finished your book. Now you want to think about, first of all, I'm hoping you know who's tapping at the window. Secondly, this is a super exciting moment because the authors again have taken the book and brought it right up to kind of the opening of the Peter Pan animated movie where Peter comes through the window. So the authors decide to have Peter return and cut the scene, which I think is the perfect way to end the fourth book. So you've now completed this book. I'm going to do a little wrap-up video for you coming up next week to kind of remind you of some things, and then I want you to rank for me the order of your books in terms of favorite, but you're going to want to watch the wrap-up video next week, or I might even have it posted by tomorrow for you to kind of refresh your memory on everything that's happened. Now that we've finished this, of course, we'll start the next book, and then we also have some exciting things that you may want to take part in as far as discussing the book on Zoom and things like that. All right, congratulations on finishing.